So we're going to talk about three terms I want to think about. Measures, evidence, and inference. Okay, and these are three terms we're going to use to talk about what in language testing. But let's leave language testing for a moment. Okay, and I'm going to ask you some questions. So the first question is, how do you know what size shoe to buy when you go to the shoe store?
You try them on.
You try them on, okay, but do you start with size 1 and then go to 2 and then?
3, 4. You already know what size shoe you wear.
Okay.
Usually.
Okay. Right. Yeah. At our age, our shoe size is pretty consistent. Do you remember when you were a kid and every time you went to buy shoes, you had to get a different size? How did you know then?
Use a ruler.
There was some kind of a ruler, right? Did everybody experience this? Yeah. Somebody measuring your foot? Did anybody experience anything different?
We just always try them on.
Trying them on, okay. So there's sort of trial and error. But with shoe size, there is actually, a ruler that we can use and say, this is how big my foot is, and I can transfer that into a number, a 44, an 8, or whatever. And it's a very clear measurement based on a rule, a measuring rule. Okay, next question. How do you know when you're hungry? Your stomach, so there's noise, there's audio, your stomach starts growling. Anything else? The time, yes, I'm very time oriented with my meals. So yeah, it's 12 o'clock, I must be hungry. Other things?
I can't work.
Huh?
I can't work if I'm hungry.
You can't work, so you start to lose concentration and focus?
I get grumpy.
Grumpy, okay, so cool. Short-tempered. Any other things?
Other people all go to have lunch and then...
Okay, you see people eating and you think you must be hungry too. Okay. Now all of these things are not direct measurements, right? You're not looking in your stomach and seeing, oh, it's pretty low. I don't know actually physiologically what you'd be looking for, but you realize that you're hungry not from directly measuring something. But over the years, you've collected evidence like your stomach growling, lack of concentration, the time, and you know that from those things you can infer that you are probably hungry and should eat. Okay? So very different from shoe size, but this kind of inference. And if we think about language testing a bit like the second example, knowing you're hungry, this helps us, I think about issues like validity in testing. Okay? So how do you know if your students can have a successful conversation in Spanish? We can't measure it directly.
But you get the idea from your classroom experience, the interaction.
You're collecting evidence, aren't you? Yeah, so you have interaction with the student, you see them do some performances, maybe there's some assessments that you do, and you're collecting evidence that you're going to use to make inferences about their ability to have a conversation in Spanish. So you can't necessarily go with them to Mexico and see how that all works out, but you're building evidence to make inferences about language ability. Okay? And that is really what validity is. You hear the term validity used a lot. That's what it is. It's how we collect evidence and then try to make inferences about what we want to measure. Okay? And so those three terms are kind of important to think about with validity. And what we hope to do is collect the best evidence. So if we're using tests as a kind of, performance on tests as a kind of evidence, we want to have the best evidence for what we're trying to measure. So we have to know what we want to measure. Okay, there's all this go back and forth. And then we need to make inferences from that evidence that are appropriate. So that's sort of another step. Okay? So this is what I want to measure. I collect information, evidence of what I think will help me make inferences, and then I make inferences about what I want to measure. Okay? So it's the appropriateness of those inferences that you make are part of validity. Okay? And so keeping that in mind, the test itself is not valid or invalid. We do talk about, oh, this test isn't valid, or this is a very highly valid test, but in fact, the test itself really isn't the key to validity. It's the use of the test, okay, and therein lies the validity. So for example, we looked at fill in the blank type questions. So you imagine you have a test where there's sentences and students are putting correct verb forms in those blanks. If I were using that as a measure or as evidence for writing ability, for example, that would be a problem for validity, right? Because the evidence wouldn't be very useful for me to make inferences about whether a student could write a paragraph or something. If I were trying to make inferences about their ability to conjugate a verb, then it might be a more valid use for that kind of a test.